Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
It's Adam in the studio, and I'm joined by BBC business editor Simon Jack. Hello, Simon.
Hello, Adam.
Lots of businessy related and numbers related stories today.
Lots of businessy stuff.
Good summary of your job there. And also we're joined by Alex Forsyth. Where in the world is Alex Forsyth?
Hello, I am in my first car park of the campaign in South Wales.
Oh, a big milestone. Glad you've pulled over. You're not driving.
No, definitely not driving. Safe, engine off, all according to the book.
And Alex, the reason you're in South Wales today is because that's where Reform UK launched their, not manifesto, their contract with the British people. And we will talk about that later on in this episode of Newscast. But you've got form chasing Nigel Farage from car park to car park, haven't you?
It has been done before, yeah. I mean, this is slightly reminiscent of the 2015 election when he was the leader of UKIP, and there were many, many car parks involved. So I'm feeling a sort of familiar sense of tarmac, gravel, building, Nigel Farage.
But first, let's talk about Labour. And Simon, I'm noticing a real kind of Rachel Reeves vibe to the start of the week. She seems to be kind of everywhere.
Well, it's no secret that Labour have gone from, the Corbyn era to speed dating business to having a whirlwind romance with business. And that took a new chapter today when she met some of her British Infrastructure Council, which included the chief executives of Lloyds Banking Group, M&G, Santander, lots of top execs from international investors like BlackRock and what have you. And it's quite interesting that she did that during an election period, because a sitting government can't do that during the Purdah period. But they were saying they were there in an advisory capacity. Nevertheless, quite an interesting thing. And I think that it's what strikes me is that their whirlwind romance with business is actually sort of upsetting some of their traditional, in their bid to woo the boardroom, they're upsetting some people on the shop floor. And for example, the Unite Union did not endorse their manifesto. So I think there is some tension at the heart of the Labour Party right there.
Which is an intriguing preview of the tensions that could exist in a Labour government, if there is one. So this Infrastructure Council, is it true that Rachel Reeves tried to do it last year, but the government phoned round the companies and said, don't you dare?
I think there was, I don't know whether one way or another, whether that's true or not. Okay. What I do think is that businesses were much more reticent about engaging with one political party or another, and obviously wanted to foster good relations with the sitting government. But businesses like us are looking at the polls and they're thinking we need to, be dealing with Reeves and Starmer. And so she had her, as I say, British Infrastructure Council meeting this morning. And I don't know where to go with
Would you know where we're going to go next?
Okay.
The B word, Brexit. So now, can I pat myself on the back first? And Alex, I don't know if you were listening to Saturday's episode of Newscast, but when we were talking about Keir Starmer's interview with Nick Robinson for Panorama, I picked up on the fact that when Keir Starmer was talking about Brexit, he talked about reducing barriers to trade overall. And I thought, even though that was just one word, that was like widening the scope of what Labour might do to change the Brexit trade deal with the EU, because previously they talked about just very narrow things like a veterinary agreement, more cooperation on security, stuff on recognising each other's qualifications, and something to make it easier for musicians and artists to go touring. I thought as soon as Keir Starmer said barriers in general, that sounded like they were up for talking about more stuff. Do you agree?
And it's fascinating. Yeah, but I think the whole thing is interesting because, of course, as we know, there are lots of people that think that Labour in particular, but not just Labour, but Labour in particular, have been trying to avoid talking about the B word, Brexit, too much during the course of this campaign and in the months preceding it, because there are some that see that as a vulnerability for the party, because the minute you talk about, as you were mentioning what Keir Starmer said, but also what we've heard from Rachel Reeves, and this was an interview she gave to the FT in which she talked about revisiting some parts of that Brexit deal to do exactly as Keir Starmer was saying, which was remove some of those trading barriers. The minute Labour starts doing that, the fear, I think, from some within the party is they would leave themselves open to the accusation, not least from the Conservatives, that, Labour's long-term plan is to take us back into the EU. That would have been the claim that was levelled against them. So it's interesting that both Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves now do appear to be at least flashing a bit of ankle in terms of this and saying they would be prepared to look again at parts of the Brexit deal if it eased trade and if it helped the economy and if it helped in their pursuit of what's one of their really key ambitions, which is, of course, economic growth. And the party is very keen to say, look, this isn't a shift in position. position. We're not changing what we're saying here at all. You know, we want to make Brexit work. We're not reopening the door to go back to the EU, trying to shut down any claim that might be levelled against them on that front. But it's interesting that the party at this point in the campaign feels at least comfortable addressing some of that, because I think, you know, there are some people that think that this should be talked about, that Brexit should be a bit more of this campaign, particularly if you think back to where we were in 2019 when it was such a central issue.
And also, Rachel Reeves said something quite interesting when she said that when people voted for Brexit, they were considering things like immigration. They weren't thinking, not uppermost of mind was, do we have the same regulations on chemicals across the board? That wasn't the issue. And saying if there are veterinary chemical regulation, recognition of qualifications, those weren't the dividing lines when it came to Brexit. So if we can make business easier, and one of the big things they're going to do when public finances are tight, they're going to look to business to do some of the heavy lifting on investment. And that's why a lot of the parties are trying to lay out, here's why business should invest. We'll give you a bit more stability. The Labour's line is stability is change, not the catchiest line of all time.
Doesn't initially make sense, but then does when you think about it.
But what they would say is we've had 4 prime ministers and 6 chancellors since 2010. And that has been an impediment to both international and domestic investment. So you want to get business to invest, just quieting it all down can help.
And let's just stick on the Brexit point for a bit, because we've got to do some tea leaf reading here, if people still read tea leaves, if it's still even possible. Is Rachel Reeves talking about chemicals regulation? Because that's the sort of thing that has just got harder as a result of the Boris Johnson Brexit deal? Or is that because she's got her eyes on, actually, this is a little side deal we could do with the EU to make chemicals regulation a bit more similar? So, but we don't really know at this stage. Anyway, let's hear how Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, was talking about Brexit today. He was visiting a port in Southampton.
We took a decision to leave the EU, so we're not going to go back in. But we think the deal we've got is botched. It's not good enough. And I think many businesses would say we need something that works better for us, because if you make it more difficult to trade, guess what? It's not so successful from our point of view. So we do think there's a better deal to be had. Obviously, that'll have to be negotiated. It does not mean going back in, but it does mean an improvement on what we've got for businesses. I think there's scope actually for improvement in other areas as well.
There we go. Keir Starmer repeating that there's scope for improvement in other areas. Simon, just to go back to this point about growth. Now, I remember not so long ago when Liz Truss was Prime Minister, and she said, we got to go for growth at all costs. Yeah. That's what's going to solve all the nation's problems. And people said, oh, you're a bit naive. But how different is what Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer is saying about dashing for growth at all costs? Although they don't say dash at all costs, but they're kind of betting the house on the same thing as Liz Truss did.
Well, not quite. No? I mean, for example, if you look at the tax and spend stuff around the Labour proposal and the Labour manifesto, it's actually quite a modest document in terms of commitments. They're talking about a national wealth fund of £7.3 billion, and they would use that. So when public investment increases, you crowd in private sector investment. And by the way, the UK's got a horrible record on business investment over the last 20 years. So it spans multiple administrations. They got the house building target of 1.5 million per year. 1.5 million over the Parliament, not dissimilar to the Conservatives.
Yeah, that would be a lot of houses, 1.5 billion a year.
Yeah,
whoa.
But on that point, planning is seen by business as one of the big issues. And they're just saying it's just harder generally to build big stuff in the UK than it is in some of the other rich nations like the US. Part of that's to do with geography. We're a crowded small island. And the Labour Party have said that they're going to have a crackdown on that and overrule councils who routinely, reject planning applications. And I think that's something that will resonate with the business community, because they say, we'd like to do this. And as I say, we've had 32 changes, I think, to the corporation tax regime in the last 14 years. A lot of people saying, if you could just give us a bit of a roadmap, and Labour are talking about that as well, then we would have a bit more confidence. The one thing that's putting off some sectors is, of course, Labour's veto on new oil and gas licences, which the SNP could cost 100,000 jobs in Scotland. The Conservative Party say would cost 200,000 jobs across the entire industry for the whole UK. That is actually, a pretty clear dividing line between the two parties, the two main parties.
And Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, was actually on an oil rig or a gas platform in the North Sea today? I saw him in a jumpsuit. No, not a jumpsuit. What do you call them?
I don't know. I've been in one myself. I've taken those helicopters too.
Oh yeah, what's it like?
It's fantastic. They basically dump you in a swimming pool in broad daylight with no waves to see whether you can cope with being turned upside down and
in case your helicopter crashes.
In case your helicopter crashes. Although being in a calm swimming pool in broad daylight, I don't think is a very good preparation for ditching in a stormy North Sea.
Yeah,
but the oil and gas thing is quite an interesting one.
I'm told it was a Centrica gas rig, not an oil rig.
Okay,
Alex, you ever been on a gas or oil rig?
No, but I have been in one of those, what you call them, boiler suits or jumpsuits, when I went out over the North Sea with the Royal Navy in my days as a little reporter at the Portsmouth News. So, yeah, that was pretty fascinating. Had to do the same thing. We had to learn how to be chucked out of a helicopter in case all went wrong. I'd say I didn't love it, if I'm honest.
I really thrived in that environment.
I've not been in many helicopters, but one time was when I went across the country with Paula Radcliffe, visiting schools, doing sports days for Newsround. That was fun.
Yeah, you thought Paula Radcliffe could have made it on her own 2 feet, couldn't you?
Well, I mean, we did cover like a few hundred miles. Even Paula, I think, would be challenged to do that, like ultra marathon. Anyway, Alex, talking about the running race of kind of more pure politics rather than policy. The thing that has got people's attention on the Tory campaign today is, yet again, Grant Shapps, the Defence Secretary, going on the radio saying that they're going to lose.
Yeah, I mean, he got a bit of a hard time from within Tourist circles, albeit largely privately, when he said before about this possibility of, we've got to stop a Labour supermajority and planting that seed around. And yet he did. He followed the same sort of path again. And I guess you might argue that there goes a kind of political train of thought, which says if you focus minds on the potential outcome of the election being between Labour and the Conservatives, then does that help the Conservatives campaign? Because, of course, you've heard time and time again the Conservatives saying it's going to be only one of two people who are standing at the podium in number 10 at the end of this whole race. But I think, you've had others now coming out in reaction to Grant Shapps saying, including the Prime Minister, basically trying to say that we've not given up, there's still a way to go and we haven't given up yet. I also just wonder what this does for Labour, because of course Labour have been really careful through this campaign to avoid the C word, not the B word, and that's complacency, and to avoid there being this kind of assumed thought that they're definitely going to win. And, you would have heard it time and time again from Labour front benches or people out and about saying not a single vote has been cast. Of course, once the postal votes start going, that's a slightly different thing. But, they don't want it to be an assumption that they're just in line, taken for granted either. So an interesting choice for Grant Shapps, who of course is normally known as one of the really solid communicators in the Conservative Party, wheeled out at the tricky moments to kind of hold the line. He went there again today.
And just in terms of the polls, there was another poll today, and of course the polls are just snapshots and they do rely on judgment by the pollsters as well, that put Reform and the Conservatives neck and neck, like that YouGov poll last week. But then since then, there have been other polls showing that there's still quite a big gap with the Conservatives leading Reform. So that's kind of the polling background to that. Although what is interesting, Alex, I've noticed as a sort of byproduct of these consistent poll leads for Labour, is it means all the other parties are being quite honest about what they can achieve. So we've talked before about the Green Party in England saying, we're only fighting 4 seats. Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader, is like, yeah, I'm taking the fight to the Tories. I want to take seats from them in the south. Labour can do what they want everywhere else. And today, Nigel Farage was launching the Reform UK contract with the British people. And he was being really explicit. He's like, this is about me becoming Prime Minister in 2029. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and he went even further than that. He launched his contract in the building behind me, which is why I'm sat in the car park, just for a bit more explanation on that front. But he went even further than that. And, he said, we are not under any illusion that we're going to win this general election and form the next government. What his pitch was that they wanted to be seen as the main party of opposition during the course of the next parliament. So, because the question you put when he launched this contract, which is 24 pages long, various policies in there. And I said to him, I put to him, is this a wish list rather than a serious plan? And his answer was, well, look, we're not saying that we're going to form the next government. We're saying we're going to campaign on these issues over the course of the next 5 years. And I think that is right. I think because Labour have had such a consistent lead in the polls for such a long time, with all the caveats around polls, what that's done is done something to the dynamics of this campaign, where exactly as you say, Adam, what you've had is the other parties positioning themselves sort of against Labour, where they might sit in a future parliament were Labour to win that majority. So I think that's why I think there's always got to be caveats and some careful reporting of polls and where they're at, because the polls themselves can change the dynamics and the nature of campaigns and change the way people perceive campaigns and change the way parties act in them. I think we're really seeing that during the course of this campaign for that exact reason.
Just so many polls and such ease of access to them if you're on social media. Simon, did you go through the reform contract with a highlighter pen? Did you highlight particular bits?
Look at this.
He actually did.
Yeah, there we go. There's my piece of paper.
Have you got a copy? Simon, have you actually got a copy with you?
He's printed it off.
It's interesting because I think the Reform are trying to position themselves as what they would like to say. We are the ambition of the Tory party, which we think has let people down, and they've pitched themselves against that and saying this is where. And there are some pretty ambitious pledges in here. Big tax cuts for small businesses, quite big tax rises for big business, which is probably an unexpected attack from the right on big business, because all I would say is that small business owners, SMEs, can vote, the owners of them. Big multinational corporations cannot. So you've got lots more small businesses than you have big multinationals. But a couple of very eye-catching pledges. They say they're going to cancel net zero targets. That would save, they think, £30 billion a year. A massive tax rate on big banks of £35 billion a year by stopping paying interest on some of the bonds that the banks hold at the Bank of England because of the quantitative easing programme. And on, as I say, so that targeting a big business, perhaps unusual one for a party on the right. A lot of people saying, look, these numbers don't add up. The £35 billion a year tax rate on banks would probably raise about 10 billion or half of 35, somewhere between 10 and 20. And the 30 billion on net zero targets, very hard thing to calculate. But what they're saying is we are going to try and appeal to the smaller business at the expense of big business. And that, I think, is an interesting line to take.
And also another big number is 50 billion, which is the amount that Nigel Farage reckons you could save from government spending by cracking down on waste. But Alex asked him whether that really was just sort of trimming a little bit here and there and spending less on staplers and post-it notes, or whether actually it means kind of deeper cuts to public spending. And this is how that conversation went.
What we're arguing for here is a very modest cut. A very modest cut.
£50 billion a year.
£5 in 100, and that's the job of the Whitehall bosses, is to save £5 in 100. And anyone who's ever worked in the private sector will tell you, when times are tough, you have to cut things. And times are tough. You know, we are massively in debt. We have to become more efficient.
So there would be cuts to public services, to be clear. Times are tough. Got to cut things. There'll be cuts to public services.
We've no desire for any cuts at all to the concept of things being free at the point of delivery.
So you can take £50 billion out of government spending with no cuts to public services.
You know what? The French have exactly the same amount of money being put in and get better returns on all health indices.
And Alex, I'll come to you in a second to expand on what they're saying about immigration. But Simon, there's another area of savings you want to highlight.
Yeah,
other people might call cuts.
A massive cut to the welfare bill. They're saying that, you know, there are some people out there who generally need help, but they just think that there are too many people on either, you know, incapacity benefits for either physical or mental health problems, and they would take an axe to that kind of spending. And it's very interesting, as you say, the largest spending increase that Reform are suggesting is an extra £17 billion a year for the NHS to try and cut or eliminate waiting lists within 2 years. Very few people I've spoken to think that's possible. A little bit out of my wheelhouse, but that's one of the things they're saying.
So, Alex, immigration and reform.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, absolutely no surprise that this was page one of their contract, not manifesto, as they like to call it, contract with the people. It's one of their centre of their whole policy pitch and has been for some time. And what they're effectively saying is that they would really limit the number of people who could come to the UK to live and work legally. So they would freeze what they call non-essential immigration. So there would be exceptions, for example, for health and care workers, but other workers, so people that come in to fill other gaps in the labour market from overseas, they would want to freeze that. So they acknowledge there would still be some immigration, but they'd like to see it vastly reduced. And again, it was interesting, picking up on the point that Simon made, I put this to Nigel Farage about the potential impact that might have on some businesses. And he again said, look, these big businesses shouldn't be relying on this overseas labour, we should be training a British workforce. And I said, well, what about the small businesses? Because there is this idea, and it is interesting, that they seem that Reform seem more willing to be seen to be on the side of small business and a bit not anti-big business, but prepared to kind of take a bit of a stick to big business. And that's exactly what Nigel Farage was saying on that point. And the second arm of their immigration pitch is about small boats, of course. So they've set out what they would call a 4-point plan. They say the reforms would have to be enacted within 100 days, and this would stop the small boat crossings. And there are various bits in that, but the one that's potentially the most eye-catching is the parties say that they would withdraw from the European Convention of Human Rights. Now, the reason that this is interesting, of course, is because this has been a point of contention within the Conservative Party, with some, particularly on the right of the Conservative Party, arguing for some time that Rishi Sunak should have committed to pulling the UK out of the European Convention of Human Rights if that court did block, for example, flights taking off to Rwanda. Rishi Sunak hasn't gone as far as to commit to that, although he said things like no foreign court would stop this policy. So, it's interesting that Reform UK have chosen to go there. It is, again, a very clear sign of where the party are pitching for voters, which is, former Conservative voters in particular. They like to say that they target Labour and Conservative voters, but a lot of the policy pitch they outlined today in this contract, I think, is pretty squarely aimed at former Conservative voters, as much as they would say it's across the board.
And a couple of other things we should mention in the reform contract, manifesto, whatever you want to call it, is they're going to say they're going to raise the threshold at which you stop paying VAT from the current 90,000, which is due to come in April, to 150,000.
Which plumbers would love.
Yeah, and they also want to abolish business rates for high street shops entirely and pay for that with a 4% tax on online deliveries from large multinational corporations. You pick one. Some people are calling it the Amazon tax.
And presumably us Amazon customers, if that's the online store you use, would end up paying that because Amazon would pass it on to you.
Well, quite. This is, and that is that, how does that get passed on? A bit like their £35 billion a year proposed tax raid on the banks. People like the Governor of the Bank of England, Rachel Reeves herself, has worried that if you just wallop the banks like that, what that will do is means that, your borrowing costs will go. It'll increase the cost of credit. Is that a good thing when you're encouraging businesses to borrow to invest into the economy?
Also on business rates, that goes back to Labour as well, because I remember being at the Labour Party conference probably in 2021 when Rachel Reeves announced she was going to abolish business rates. And we said, yeah, but with what? And they were like, a better system that would tax online stores more than bricks and mortar stores. But we'll get back to you. And then 3 years later in the manifesto, it still says we'll replace business rates with something TBC. Anyway, just a little
it's a big earner. It's 30 billion quid a year. So replace it at your peril if you're the Chancellor.
Yeah, one of the top 6 taxes, I think, is in terms of revenue raisers. Also, we should just say the reason Reform are not calling their manifesto a manifesto and calling it a contract is because Nigel Farage says most voters, he thinks, associate the word manifesto with lies. And I think he said it in capital letters. And also, it's another interesting thing of Reform borrowing from North American politics, because I was saying at the weekend, I was reading that book about Canada, and there the challenges to the Progressive Conservative Party in Canada in the 90s were called the Reform Party. Nigel Farage has borrowed their name. Also, do you remember in the 90s, Newt Gingrich and the Republicans? His contract with America.
Do you remember
He was the one that popularised the idea of having a contract with the voters.
Didn't he start? Wasn't he the first person to do the 100 days thing? I seem to remember 100 days.
No, that's JFK. JFK's speechwriter.
There's my history lesson.
You started the clock too late there, Simon. Look at me schooling you. Oh my God, that never happens.
Well, it's in politics. I don't.
It's your hobby rather than
it's a hobby rather than my job.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, Alex, just before we go, on Reform, they've had problems with another candidate. This is a guy called Grant Sinclair Armstrong.
Yeah, so it's the latest comments that he's made, and this time, sorry.
Oh.
So I'm so sorry.
You're still with us. Has someone else calling you?
I just need to explain because I'm doing this from my phone. And somebody phoned. Yeah, I know. I'm sorry.
Is Ringo telling you your time's up?
I need to renew my parking. It's also incredibly hot in a car in the sun with the windows open. I'm like a kind of dog sweltering in the heat at the moment. I need to open a window and get some air. But yes, so Reform have had problems with a few candidates, and we've had comments that they've made in the past which have been thrown up, and some have then had to stand down as candidates, although of course they still appear on the ballot paper because it's past the point where you can actually remove somebody off the ballot paper. And again, I put this to Nigel Farage today, and he has spoken about it and makes the point that, his argument is that other parties have had problems with candidates too. But I think the question for Reform is whether this speaks to the fact they've had to kind of jack up their efforts so quickly for this election campaign? Were they really ready for it? Do they have the resource? Do they have the people in place to fight the campaign of this nature? Because there have been a few problems now with some of the candidates, and particularly regarding comments that they've made, mostly in the past, that have now come to light as a consequence of them standing in such a public platform like a general election.
I remember Richard Tice at some rally sort of saying, if you've had a glass of wine, just lay off the social media, whatever. Probably good advice for all parties, I imagine.
And probably journalists as well.
Yeah, true.
No, talking about advice, we're all going to be staying up all night quite soon for the election night, and lots of people are going to be coming to Broadcasting House for the Newscast all-nighter, where with me you're going to watch the election night programme on a big screen with some sofas and beanbags and some very modest refreshments. I'm sure you've both done all-nighters for work before. What are your tips, Simon? Bananas, yeah, that's what David Dimbleby
always has a banana at hand. I think that's a pretty good one.
Alex?
Lots of water.
Yes, and not coffee.
I've made the mistake in the past of doing the whole loads of sweets, loads of coffee, loads of diet caffeine drinks. No more. Bananas, nuts, water. That's all you need in your life.
Oh, we've all grown up, because I too have abandoned the
sad.
loads and loads of sugary sweets for this year. Although we'll see. The proof will be in the pudding of no pudding.
We can gorge ourselves when it's all over.
Yeah, exactly, and then fall asleep. And if you would like to join us in the BBC Radio Theatre for the Newscast all-nighter, you can apply for a ticket in the BBC shows and tours section of the website, and a link to that is in the description, the Newscast show description on your podcasting app. And there is a process you have to go through. So just applying, unfortunately, doesn't guarantee you a spot on the beanbag next to me, but give it a go. Simon, lovely to see you.
Nice to see you, Adam.
And Alex, safe travels.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
And we'll be back with another episode of Newscast very soon. Thanks for listening to this one. Bye.
Newscast from the BBC.